I'm Ralph Schroeder. I'm a professor here, and we are here to this wonderful talk, Communicating Climate Change in Digital Spaces, How Skeptical Views of Science and Knowledge Overconfidence Challenge Science Communication on Social Media. We have Niels Meade here today, who is in Zurich, and he has worked with Mike Schaefer, who will be familiar to many of you as a kind of scholar of climate change communication. Niels is rapidly becoming a major scholar in this field himself. He is particularly expert in survey methodologies, but he's also done a lot of work on digital media. He is also developing with Mike certain ideas about populism and the relation to science communication. So what we'll do is we'll have a half hour, 40 minutes or so. It is being recorded because it's a very nice day. Everybody's here, and maybe there are people online. Can you see anybody online?
I can't see anyone, but I see just a number of 8 participants. So I think somebody's out there.
Somebody's out there. Hello. Hi. All right. And please, we are recording. If you not like to be recorded, let us know. And we will also have a Q&A in the chat. So if you have questions about what Niels is saying in the chat, please just use the Q&A box. And Niels, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph. Hello and welcome everyone here in the room, but also those people online. I wave to the camera out there. I'm very happy that you're here and spend some time listening to my talk and maybe asking questions afterwards. Thank you very much for the introduction, Ralph. I don't have much more to say, I think, but I'll still give a little context on myself and the talk I'm going to present to you today. So, as you said, I'm a science communication researcher from University of Zurich, and currently my research centers on climate change communication and social and online media, as well as public perceptions of science in general. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Speak about challenges to climate communication and science communication digital spaces, focusing on 2 particularly relevant challenges: science skepticism or populism and knowledge overconfidence. But more on that later. Since May and until August this year, I'm a visiting research fellow here at the Oxford Internet Institute, working with Ralph Schroeder on climate change communication on social media, while also pursuing my work at the University of Zurich, where I study different aspects of science communication, particularly communication on digital media. One of the main focal points of my previous research has been public criticism of science, be it in the form of populism, skepticism, or hostility towards science and scientists. More recently, I actually also do research on science literacy, asking what people know about science, scientific processes, science's role in society, and how people use online and offline media to get reliable information about science and specific scientific topics such as COVID or climate change. And as Ralph said, I am working with surveys usually, but also apply qualitative interviews recently in another study, and have started working with social media data. Overall, I think it's fair to say that my research, also teaching and public outreach, is concerned with sort of the status of science and science communications within society, and with questions about which dynamics and phenomena challenge it, particularly in online media and in social media environments. Because many, as you may know, there's currently much concern about perils and pitfalls, so to say, of online science communication. It's chronic growing pains, as Dominique Brassin, Dietram Schäufele called it. And there's also concern about the challenges of climate change communication specifically. Some of these concerns mention, for example, the complexities of the science and the language of climate change, for example. But other sort of arguments focus on broader societal processes and public discourse dynamics. For example, there are concerns which are importantly backed by empirical evidence that social media communication about climate change is getting increasingly polarized, such as that climate skeptical views are more prevalent among conservative political groups and pro-climate views linked to liberal groups with both groups often barely talking with each other on Twitter, for example, during the COP conferences, as this study found. Further challenge to effective climate communication includes misinformation about the existence, causes, consequences, and so on of climate change. And this has recently been discussed, for example, against the background of artificial intelligence and social media algorithms, which allegedly facilitate the spread of such misinformation. Another phenomenon undermining climate communication, particularly social media conspiracy theories, such as this claim that a shift in the magnetic field of the Earth is causing climate change and not human activity, which is currently being spread on TikTok, somewhat with the help of the popular US comedian and podcaster Joe Rogan. Fourthly, many have been worrying about an epidemic of overconfidence, as Vox called it somewhat dramatically. The argument here goes that more and more people and social media users sort of overestimate how much they actually know about scientific issues, and possibly believe or even spread false, misleading information about science, be it COVID, nutrition, GMOs, or climate change. And there's actually research showing that people do tend to overestimate their knowledge about climate change, for example, depending on their level of education and then depending on their attitudes towards climate change. And lastly, fifth, I picked up another challenge to climate and science communication. Science populism, science-related populism. This populism can, to give you a little impression about that, manifest in like famous statements like these by Michael Gove, who said, "I think the people of this country have had enough of experts and organizations with acronyms saying that they know what is best, but getting it consistently wrong." And similar criticisms can also be observed among parts of the public, for example, at demonstrations, protests, with this protester showing a sign that he claims to know more than the scientists, as it ironically says on this poster. Well, in these positions, you may now wonder why are these examples indications of populism or even science populism? And I would argue that these are populist because they feature the key elements of populism. They suggest a conflict between an immoral scientific or societal elite, the experts and scientists, and the good, virtuous citizens, the people. And this conflict is science-related, first of all, because it refers to an academic elite, scientists and experts, and rather than to a political or economic elite. And second, because it does not so much revolve around political authority, but rather around epistemic authority, truth-speaking authority. I know what is best. I know more than the scientists. So this populism is rather about scientific truth claims than about political power claims. I would argue, and as I and Mike Schäfer conceptualized this form of populism as science-related populism. As I mentioned in the beginning, my research has been concerned mostly with the two-letter challenges, knowledge overconfidence and science populism. And that is what I'm going to focus on in the remainder of my talk today. In particular, I'll present two recent studies that colleagues and I did in order to examine how overconfidence or overestimation and science populism are related to each other, and how each of them is linked to social media use, meaning to exposure to social media information about different scientific issues, including climate change, and to social media engagement, commenting, liking, sharing, and so on, is information. Before I show you the results of these studies, I'll just give you a little background on why these four building blocks, these four components should actually be related or could actually be related to each other. So first, there's conceptual and empirical scholarship suggesting that overestimating one's knowledge about science, scientific issues such as climate change or COVID, can be caused actually by frequent exposure to online information about these issues or social media information about these issues. Why? Because social media often, this is one argument, often overload people or users with an abundance of potentially false information without providing users sort of adequate means to deal with this overload and to assess information credibility. One argument here is that the affordances of social media platforms, so they have functions and architectures, vaguely paraphrasing that, are not always helpful for users when they try to assess information credibility, without users necessarily recognizing this, that it is not helpful. For example, emotional cues such as emojis or popularity metrics such as the number of likes and shares and comments may lead users to think that they know where to find good information and how to discern true from false information and so on. However, this is not always the case. So likes can indicate popularity, but not necessarily credibility. But users may often not be aware of this, which has been described against the backdrop of easiness effects, for example. And moreover, functionalities like bookmarking or filtering functions, and for example, snack news headlines in social media feeds may give users sort of a feeling of knowing, like also an illusion of knowing, as some have called it. So they think they know where to find things, but are less inclined to memorize and learn new knowledge. This is another argument of scholars suggesting that social media exposure can lead to knowledge overconfidence or overestimation. Overconfident people also often tend to care less about what others think about them and are often more inclined to share their views on social media or in public in general. So knowledge overconfidence in turn may then cause users to be more outspoken, more vocal on social media, comment, like, share, and so on more frequently. These phenomena are presumably more likely among young adults. There's at least some research that suggests that, because first, overconfidence is often more likely among young people. That's a sort of robust finding in the research or in the literature. Also because adolescents or young adults often have sometimes have less factual knowledge about certain things because they are younger and had so much time to learn stuff, but they are also often less aware of this deficit, as the studies by Lazarovitz and also Kaplan and Gaskin showed. So it is reasonable to assume that these dynamics may also, and maybe also particularly, occur among younger people. So why should knowledge overestimation link to science populism? Here, the argument goes that both are conceptually related to each other in some sort of way, because both science populism and knowledge overconfidence or overestimation include a certain skepticism towards knowledge claims of epistemic authorities and imply sort of depreciation of personal lay knowledge and depreciation of external expert knowledge. So they have some sort of common roots, so to say, I would argue that. And plausibly then, research has actually also shown that, that not only overconfidence, but also populism in general is related to, can be related to higher social media use and also higher social media engagement. So it is reasonable to assume that science populism may actually increase or fuel or promote effects of exposure on overconfidence and engagement. So in order to test these relationships and dynamics, we conducted two studies that I'm going to show you now. First study was about climate change, knowledge overestimation, knowledge about climate change. It did not focus on science populism, more on that later, but it considered specifically young adults. It was a survey study, which we did last year in Germany. It was a 4-wave panel study, online survey in Germany, with about 1,300 participants, aged between 19 and 29 years, 18 and 29 years. Maybe some words on the measures, especially the first is maybe the most important one. How did we measure overestimation, overconfidence? And we did this by using quiz about climate change statements. This was about like the causes and consequences of climate change, but also how you can adapt in your daily life and sort of to prevent climate change in a way. And you could get a certain score as a respondent by answering the questions correctly. And then we also had another question asking for how knowledgeable respondents perceive themselves to be. How much do you think you know, or how well informed do you think you are about climate change? And then we just computed the difference of like the actual knowledge result of the quiz and the perceived climate knowledge self-assessed. Exposure to social media information was measured with like a mean index of use of and also trust in 6 different digital information sources, such as social networking site profiles of influencers, of politicians. We had this of friends, I think, yes. Engagement was some score, like the amount of 7 communication behaviors respondents engaged in over the past months on social media, for example, commenting or liking, sharing. And with a bunch of covariates, also political orientation, for example, also perceived climate information overload. Briefly to the results, what we found was actually a positive effect, like within subjects effect of exposure on knowledge overconfidence. So people, respondents, young adults actually who were reporting more frequent exposure to more frequent use of social media were more likely to overestimate their knowledge about climate change.
Sorry, use of social media for climate change.
No, it was not
general.
in general.
Okay.
Yeah, that's important to mention. Good point. So it's the measure was not about climate change in specific. Also, the engagement measures were not about climate change specifically, but in general. And this within subjects effect is indicative of a causal effect. So that's one positive aspect of one advantage of our panel survey design, that we could test this causal effect. Although we have to mention that it's rather small, this effect, and only significant at the 0.05 level. We also found positive effect of overestimation on engagement. So the more people overestimate their knowledge about climate change, the more likely they are to be vocal, outspoken, or sort of share their views and opinions on social media. And this was actually, it's a detail, but I mentioned it. It was a between subjects effect. So this is rather only correlational evidence. So we can't really claim a causal effect there. So much on the most important findings of this study. Now to the second one. I'll go back to this background slide because to show you that the second study focused also on science populism, but not anymore on young adults. And it was concerned with COVID. So another scientific issue, not climate change anymore. And this time we actually measured social media exposure to information about COVID specifically and engagement with social media information or content about COVID specifically. And this time we also studied two countries, not only Germany, but also Taiwan. It was back in 2020, so during the COVID pandemic. The overestimation measure was quite similar, although it was more extensive. So we had 12 quiz items here along different dimensions of COVID knowledge. Also some background knowledge questions about biology and epidemiology. And we also had 4 questions for the perceived level of COVID knowledge. Exposure this time, as I said, was not only focusing on social networking sites. No, it was, as I said, focusing on COVID knowledge, COVID exposure specifically. And it was not only about social networking sites, but also reported exposure to such information on instant messages. Engagement was willingness to like, share, or comment COVID information on social networking sites or instant messages. And the science-related populist attitudes were measured with a scale that colleagues and I developed previously. It was an 8-item scale that asked for agreement with statements such as scientific knowledge is, or like common sense is more important than scientific studies, for example. On these 8 items, the 8 questions were like indicative of science-related populist attitudes. And again, we had a bunch of covariates, including political orientation. Results, what did we find? We did not find effects of exposure on social media to COVID information on knowledge overestimation, on overconfidence. But we did find positive effects of overestimation on engagement actually in both countries. Not super strong effects, but quite significant effects, both in Germany and Taiwan, a little stronger in Germany. And as expected, we also found a considerable correlation of knowledge overconfidence and science populism in both countries. So the more populist attitudes people had to science, thinking that common sense is more worth than scientific research, for example, the more likely they were to overestimate their knowledge about COVID. And we also did find a positive effect of science populism on social media engagement. The picture here, I think it was even a little stronger than the effect of overestimation on engagement in both countries. Actually, we did not find many differences between Germany and Taiwan. Except for that overestimation was related more strongly to engagement on instant messengers in Germany than in Taiwan. So in Taiwan, instant messaging engagement was not so clearly related to overconfidence. So where does this lead us? What does this mean for climate communication, for science communication? And I noted down a couple of thoughts. And first of all, maybe the thought that I would say actually at least that it is concerning that overestimation, knowledge overestimation, social media exposure and engagement and science-related populism may drive each other in certain contexts, but for different scientific topics. So what could be countermeasures? How can we address that challenge? We as scientists, we as science communicators, maybe even platform owners or like people responsible for platform governance, interventions on social media platforms, such as accuracy nudges or moderation efforts, sort of functions that confirm, that require you to confirm if you have to if you really want to post or comment something, it could be helpful. Teaching more science literacy and sort of knowledge about metacognitive biases, such as overestimation, might also be helpful, even conveying some sort of intellectual humility. That's what sort of intervention experiments on knowledge overestimation found, at least. Although it's definitely challenging to implement these measures. I would argue also that it's important to really to strengthen other sort of intermediaries at the intersection of science and society beyond social media, such as journalism, science journalism, quality science journalism, which is in a sort of difficult situation in many countries worldwide, also in the UK, but also in Germany, Switzerland, and so on. So these intermediaries, these quality science journalists, might need more financial support by governments, but maybe also foundations or philanthropists, to be able to provide high quality science information and really sort of fulfill some sort of function in like educating publics, if you want to put it like that. Also, I think we as people from academia should engage in like self-reflection about the limitations of our own communication. And I put this as a last point here. I think it's really important to notice or to mention that what I just showed you are just two studies on two countries, which did not even focus on specific platforms, but we asked for social media and instant messengers in general. We did not differentiate between Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, Discord, Reddit, WhatsApp, and so on, all these different platforms which have different affordances and different conditions that they are providing to users. And as I said, we only focused on Germany and Taiwan yet. But we should also should not generalize our findings to other countries from the global south. And this leads me to like some sort of appendix that I decided to put into this talk today. Because in the last slides, I want to show you how different publics can be in terms of their attitudes to climate change and in their use of social media and in the relationship of both. And currently, I am involved co-leading a global survey study with Victoria Colonia. And this is a many-lab study. So we have acquired a big group of more than 220 collaborators in 64 countries worldwide to field the very same survey translated to the local languages. And yesterday I just looked into the data to find out about some results that might be interesting for my talk. This is actually our coverage. So we have countries from many regions, also from the global south and from like sort of Latin America, for example. Some countries are also missing. We will have data from Uganda actually. Haven't received it yet, but maybe next week or something. What did we find? This is trust in climate scientists, which we measured on a 5-point scale. So 1 is low trust and 5 is high trust. It's just one item, but it's at least something. And we asked for how much do you trust climate scientists? And we see quite some variation here. We tried to use representative samples across countries, but in some countries, such as India, we fielded the survey in English. So that means that these samples are likely a little biased towards higher educated population groups. But still, we can see interesting variation here that trust in climate scientists is high in certain countries, but quite below average in other countries, for example, from Latin America, like Nicaragua, Bolivia, Uruguay, Peru, and so on. And the second slide shows now the relationship of social media use and trust in climate scientists. Social media use was measured actually with as specific to science. So how often do you use social media to inform yourselves about science? And we had a 7-point scale, ranging from never to daily, I think. What we can see here is first, all countries that are dark gray, then we don't find a significant relationship between trust in climate scientists and social media use. All countries that are colored in red or dark red, then we see a positive relationship between social media use and trust. So the more people use social media, the more they trust climate scientists. I mean, the underlying dynamics of these relationships are quite difficult to disentangle, maybe. But it definitely, but it shows in a way, I would say, that social media are not always related to distrust or skepticism or even populist attitudes toward science. You can go as far in interpreting these results, but in other countries, like these which are blue, Turkeys, there we see a negative relationship. So in some Latin American countries, also some East European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, we see a negative relationship, which means that people who use social media more often are more likely to have less trust in climate scientists. And this all goes to show that, we do have to differentiate between different publics, different countries, different social media sort of ecologies or environments when discussing how should we deal with critical attitudes, but maybe with some of the challenges that are presented in the beginning when doing climate communication. I'll leave it with this. Thank you very much for your attention.
It's great. Do you see the questions in the chat there? Any
Yes and
questions
no.
yet?
So I do see questions if there were any.
Oh, so there aren't any.
I think so.
Okay. Well, if you're out there, please post your questions because we'll be going for a little while, but we are very happy to take them and just type them if you can. I don't think they can speak, but yeah, just post your questions, please. We'll be here for a little while. Floor is open, please. Questions, comments?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Maybe this is implicit in your research, but I didn't hear you mention it explicitly. I mean, maybe it's implicit, but I didn't hear you mention it explicitly. So I wondered, do you think the media concept of filter bubbles could explain, say, that relationship between social media exposure and say knowledge or confidence?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to discuss. Yeah. What's my key? Anyways, yes, thank you. Yeah, I think thank you for the question. I think first of all, it's important to think a little bit about the concept of filter bubbles itself and maybe about the actual prevalence of that, because there is some research showing that there are some climate change communication filter bubbles, echo chambers, but there's other research that shows that they are not that prevalent, or they are a sort of minority phenomenon, and there is actually sort of vivid discussion among skeptics and proponents of climate change in other contexts. So I think there is some debate about whether they are actually a problem at a big scale. What I do think, but I'm not aware of systematic research about that, is that sort of algorithmic curation on social media platforms does play a significant role, or does play a measurable role in supplying people with information that matches their worldviews and their attitudes. So that's basically one of the business models of Facebook and other social media platforms. So it's could play a role that it could well be that people with critical attitudes about climate change, or I mean skeptical attitudes towards it, see more and more information about that, which may then reinforce sort of effects of whatever the effects of these attitudes may be. But I think they might not cause non-existing effects. So they might even just increase existing effects, these sort of reinforcement through algorithmic curation. Does that make sense?
Yes. If I could just follow up on that.
Yes.
I mean, so the technical discussion of filter bubbles is quite, I mean, we could get into the details there, but presumably the findings that you have are adjust for the fact of whether people use social media exclusively to find out about either COVID or climate change. In other words, whether they're in a kind of social media bubble as opposed to a filter bubble, because filter bubble means that they're kind of separating themselves within certain views. But you've adjusted for what I just said, which is,
True.
do they also, read newspapers and talk to friends about climate change or COVID and so on? You've adjusted for that.
Exactly, because we can't say anything about like the political position of the content that people are exposed to. So we just asked for for COVID information in general. And in the first study, we did not even ask for climate information, in particular social media information in general. So yet, in that sense, it sort of adjusts for that.
I know you mentioned that you didn't differentiate between different social media platforms, but do you think there is a relationship between the type of content people consume and whether their knowledge overestimation? Because I'm just thinking, like if they consume videos versus like short form Twitter photos.
Very good point. I do think there's a difference, and we have to test it and find out what the differences are. For example, it's interesting that we at least found a difference between social networking sites and instant messages in the second study, which was about COVID, not about climate, which was that actually, as I said, the relationship of overestimation and instant messenger engagement was not so pronounced in Taiwan, barely there. But still, this is not about platforms, but about certain modes, maybe of social media or digital media engagement. Well, and it's important to say that there is lots of high quality science communication, climate communication on YouTube, for example. It's not all like under complex or sensationalist or emotionalist or even misleading content, not at all. So it's really important to disentangle the different platforms and see maybe if sort of as you said, like very reduced short communication forms of communication, which are sometimes more geared to whatever emotional cues on, say, Instagram, are more likely to cause overestimation than maybe more thoughtful pieces on, I don't know, blogs or even Mastodon, maybe some other social media. I mean, I am assuming that there is more high quality content. That's another premise that we have to test, but I do think that there are differences.
Yeah, so my background is more like in political sociology, so perhaps this is an obvious one considering that. But like, what do you think is like just the spillover of this into like engagement in politics and society? Because like obviously you just like this overconfidence is an attitude at first, right? But what could potentially kind of be the knock-on effect? Also, similarly, when you look at kind of science-related populism, but how does this relate to people who vote for populist parties?
You mean spillover like into politics?
Into politics or society?
On society. Maybe speaking of first to the overestimation component, I think well, it could be actually that because people who overestimate their knowledge are more likely to be outspoken on social media, their views and their opinions are more likely to spread among their peers and among their families, because they have this tendency of being vocal and outspoken about their views. I mean, from just sharing their views to convincing others, it's a big step, and changing attitudes and beliefs is like it's difficult and rarely happens on a regular basis. On a regular basis.
Okay.
It happens, but it's not like we have this, whatever, 30, 40, 1930s, 1940s hyperdynamic needle model where you can just persuade everyone with media content and with sharing opinions. I mean, it's still possible, of course, and many other factors. And that's why I would also assume that really affecting vote choice does happen, but maybe not like really on a like big scale. But if you like discuss it or treat it the other way around, if you have these sort of opinion leaders, these politicians promoting science skeptical claims in their agendas and so on, then there might be actually some impact on the voters later on. Yeah, so I won't say that this is not there aren't any problems with spillover effects, but I think it's always important to really like gather evidence about the scope, the impact of this whole spillover process.
And then just one question.
Yes.
In your research, when you think of like science skepticism, do you usually like always conceptualize it as science populism? Or do you separate these two things as well?
Yeah, that's a big question because there are many different terms floating around for different forms of science criticism. Maybe that's an umbrella term, or yeah, some say skepticism, some say anti-science views or sentiments, and I'm not sure if there's really like a standing definition for science skepticism, because you can go with like these non-rational skeptical resentments, thinking that scientists are whatever weird people who don't understand me as a like ordinary person. This could be science skepticism, but you could also go with Merton and saying that skepticism is an inherent process of science, and it's important to have some sort of healthy skepticism about claims to really test if they hold up to scrutiny. So long story short, I would say that science populism is just one form of anti or science criticism among many others.
But we don't have a sense of how extensive all these forms of anti-science are overall, how strong or weak they are.
You mean extensive in terms of?
Well, if you add up all the different, I mean, there must be, if you think about it, there must be one measure of, populism plus skepticism plus whatever, as against, science, let's call it science affirming, or, science trusting. I mean, these are difficult terms, but, ultimately, you're going to want to divide them into two, rather than saying, there's just too many and we can't add them up. Or?
Yeah, well, yeah, and you say there must be a measure, but I don't think there is, and I don't think it's possible to develop like a working, properly functioning measure to do that, because you have so many different aspects to consider. First, the different nuances and intensities, then the different reference objects. Do I distrust or skeptical of skepticism towards scientists or towards science in general, scientific methods, different disciplines? What are maybe you want to differentiate between different motives of distrust, skepticism, whatever. Sort of, is it because I consider common sense superior to scientific studies? Is it because I think scientists are biased by third interests? So I think that's really difficult to add up and grasp with one measure.
But it's also problematic not to have one measure.
It
Because if you
is.
then you can't say, oh, well, science skepticism,
Yeah.
whatever the umbrella is, has been growing or decreasing over time.
Yeah.
That's not good.
It is, completely agree. And I mean, it's even problematic to use different, it is problematic to use different terms. For example, when you measure trust, some say trust, some say confidence.
Right.
The Pew surveys, Josh mentioned them, I guess, have use the wording of confidence. The Eurobarometer surveys use trust, I think. So it's, you can't really compare these. And it's a problem that many use single item measures. How much do you trust in comparison to how much do you support certain dimensions of trust? That's really difficult. Yeah.
Sorry, should we also look there?
Yeah, Josh had one question online.
Yeah,
Um,
let's read it out, shall we? Do you want to read it out?
I can read it out, yes. Hi, Josh. Have you looked at what do you make of the Pew data around trust in different kinds of scientists among Americans? Also in studies, is there a difference between the concepts of trust versus credibility that actually resonates with what I've just been talking about? Well, I've read, like, I followed the Pew research, and I think actually I would criticize what I just mentioned, that they usually measure trust often with big single item measures, or they ask for confidence in scientific community, which is maybe something different than really trust in science. And what is actually trust in science? Is it trust in the outcomes? Is it trust in the in the methods, and what is trust in the first place? Exactly. How is trust different to credibility, or to sort of willingness to be vulnerable? So John Besley would say, well, one aspect, or you could conceptualize trust as the willingness to be vulnerable to scientists. So you do want to have, you have open questions about certain things, how to live a good life, so to say. But you can solve these questions, so you have to rely is another term, on scientists to provide guidance and knowledge about these questions.
So is Josh also giving us what Pew said about Americans? Or do you know? I mean, or does anyone know? I mean, what does it say?
Yeah, I don't know. So just maybe you want to clarify and explain a little bit.
Tell us about Americans, please.
Yes, he posted a link. I'm not sure what happens if I open the link. Maybe I shut down the whole, like I just try. We see it. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
I'm actually I was not thinking about this, but it
Right.
is still using the confidence measure, I think. Yeah, I came across this study, and I think I did not put too much. I was not too much too concerned about this, because what we see here is like an increase in trust during the pandemic and a decrease now. And this is like what the headlines says, I think, right? The trust of Americans and scientists is on the decline after the pandemic, sharply, even as they find. And I was not now seeing, well, yeah, we do see this big increase, this peak in trust in science confidence during the pandemic. But I would say no, well, this has just normalized now after the pandemic really just faded out. It is not like we are now on a level below pre-pandemic levels. So I was not really concerned about this. And I was also not super surprised by the fact that trust in science peaked during the pandemic, because we found this in other countries as well, also in Switzerland and in Germany, for example. One argument behind this would be, for example, that during the pandemic, or as the pandemic hit, people were looking for some sort of help in orientation, reliable knowledge that would help them really solve the pandemic or help society solve the pandemic. And one of these sources of orientation, of guidance, of knowledge was science. So people rallied around science. I mean, we had similar, maybe you know that we had similar dynamics with trust in politics. So trust in governments was also peaking during the pandemic and as the pandemic hit, because people in their insecurity in this crisis were unsure how this all would develop. So they trusted the leaders more than before. Now, as this sort of need for guidance, need for orientation is on the decline, trust in scientists is also on the decline. That's what I make of these findings.
Good question, then.
Yes.
I'm also wondering, like, maybe there's a negative correlation between trust in scientists and trust in government. Because I know in India, for example, like the trust, there's kind of a sense that people trust in scientists because they don't have another option, like they don't trust the government, they don't trust media. So they kind of, that's their fallback option. And I don't know, there was low trust in elected officials
I mean, above here,
and that
here.
as well. So I don't know, maybe
That's actually really interesting, because there's actually a competing argument which says, well, people do have, if they trust one institution in society, they trust all institutions. So it's just like reliance on government, scientists, religious leaders, and so on, or none of them. There's also some argument. I mean, there's empirical evidence also on that, so that different institutions like are linked to each other. But it's really important, interesting that this might be different in India.
Yeah. Any other questions online there? Okay.
And I hope, Josh, I answered your question. If not, please follow up.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I mean, can I just ask one more? I mean, I think, you know, I'm still trying to get my head around this notion of overconfidence, you know, because I guess what I'm wondering is if you, what kind of questions do you ask? Because is it more that they are overconfident in their like general opinions, or are the questions designed to really tease out, you know, can you really differentiate whether they actually know more facts about climate change? I mean, you know, how do you separate that? Because, you know, I can imagine that somebody is very active, socially engaged on social media. You know, they're just generally more brash, if you want to put it that way, or more outspoken. But your questions are specifically designed like for not expert knowledge, but for kind of general scientific literacy. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Yeah. If you want to, yeah, they are designed to capture really factual knowledge about climate change or about COVID. In the COVID study, we went a little broader. We did not only capture like factual knowledge, how is a virus transmitted and so on, but also about procedural knowledge. So the science behind COVID, so to say. So which means.
And what do you ask there?
How we,
like, for an example.
Something like developing a COVID vaccine also requires animal experiments. So it's something about like the process behind research on COVID.
Does it? I don't actually know the answer to that question.
Yeah, well, but at least you're aware that you don't know the answer.
That's good. No, but I mean, is it? I mean, do you have?
Yeah, I mean,
you do have to have animal experiments.
yeah, to test it. Well, and then it's also important to have a look at how we measure perceived knowledge, self-assessed knowledge. And we asked for how well informed do you feel about it.
and then on a scale.
Yes.
I think that-
Yeah.
And you had, I mean, at least in the first study, you had a wave design, so you could tease out at least some kind of causation or
Mhm.
explanation.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Other questions or comments? I mean, we're going to stick around and have a nice discussion, but anything more in the chat there? No, no, great. Well, thank you so much again. We'll end and fantastic. And please stick around if you want to have a more informal chat now. And thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, online people.
Thank you, online people. We'll shut down the online, but you're welcome to email Niels with questions.
Exactly. Yes. Please do email me or follow me on Twitter.